As has already been stated, this morning we want to continue our series of studies on the qualifications of an elder, or the qualities that should be looked for in an elder of the Lord's church. And I'd like to thank the brothers who have already presented lessons in this area, Nate and Daniel. I think they've done an excellent job. I must admit that in the beginning it seemed a rather intimidating task to stand before the congregation and try to expound on each of these qualities beyond the obvious face value meaning, even though the leaders have actually been studying these for several months now. But I've learned a great deal, and I hope that something I have to share will be beneficial to us all. I also want to remind you of something that Nate said in his first lesson in this series when he was introducing the topic and setting the stage, if you will, of the qualifications as a whole. And that is that while these qualifications are listed as characteristics that must be expected of an elder, most of these characteristics or qualities are things that should be expected of all Christians. In other words, these behaviors and attitudes, for the most part, should be the standard for us all. It's not that elders only must live up to these values. It's that an elder should be an example to others in how to live these qualities out in our everyday lives. And while some of the characteristics may not be required of all Christians, for example, it's not required that all Christians, or that all Christian men rather, be married or have children. However, those that are married are expected to be faithful husbands, and those that do have children are to fulfill their role as a godly father. And multiple passages throughout the New Testament teach us that we all should be sober-minded and self-controlled and so forth. And such is the case with the three qualifications that we're going to study this morning. The requirements that an elder must be respectable, well thought of by outsiders, and hospitable. Those characteristics, as we'll hopefully see as we study each one, they are required of all Christians. No one should say, well, I don't have to be respectable. I don't have to be well thought of. I don't have to be hospitable because I'm not an elder. That would be silly. And it would be contradictory to other scriptures as well. And I say all that to say this. In case you might be tempted to check out, so to speak, from the lessons in this series, to think to yourself, well, this doesn't apply to me. I'm not going to be an elder. On the contrary, it does apply to you. First, because if we as a congregation are to choose men to lead us as elders, then we need to make sure, all of us, that is, that we understand these qualifications. If we're going to buy in to the agreement to follow and be led by these men, then we need to make sure that we are choosing wisely. But secondly, because, again, as we study these qualities individually, hopefully we are learning how we all can grow and how we all can become better Christians. The Christians that the Lord wants us to be and the Christians that the world needs us to be, needs to see in order to be led closer to the truth themselves. And so with that in mind, let's begin by reading the passages in which we find the qualities under consideration this morning. In 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 7, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version here, Paul writes, "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil." And then in Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, Paul once again writes, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination, for an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. As we've noticed before, Paul did not list these qualities in these two letters to two different people here, to Timothy and Titus. He did not list these qualities in the same order in the two letters, nor are the qualifications identical. In other words, there are a few qualities mentioned to Timothy that were not specified to Titus, and vice versa. And as well, when we consider different translations or different versions, that makes it somewhat difficult to maybe line up these qualities between these two lists. I found one attempt that I thought did a pretty good job of it. This is taken from the ESV Global Study Bible. But as you can see, only one of the qualities that we want to study this morning is listed in both epistles, that an elder must be hospitable. That's mentioned to both Timothy and to Titus. The fact that an elder must be respectable and well thought of by outsiders is not specifically named in Titus, although I think that those qualities could perhaps be included in these that Titus mentioned, that being a lover of good, upright, and holy. Well, let's begin with a closer look at the quality of being respectable. Paul tells Timothy that an elder of the church must be respectable, as it's translated in the ESV. The Greek word that's used here is kosmios, which has been defined as conduct or behavior that is well arranged, seemly, decent, proper, modest, respectable, living with decorum, a well-ordered life. Some other versions or translations use the word respectable, including the ESV as we read, the NIV, the New American Standard, the New Revised Standard. Other versions have in place of respectable words or phrases such as of good behavior. That's found in the King James and New King James. Orderly is how the American Standard Version puts it. Have a good reputation is found in the NLT. And dignified is how the Revised Standard Version puts it. I understand that this same Greek word is used actually only once elsewhere in the New Testament. That's in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 9, where Paul is speaking of the attire or dress and the conduct of women. And there he says, again in the ESV, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel. Now, of course, most of us are more familiar with the King James Version translation of modest apparel. But I think that we learned something here, that this word in the original Greek, it carries with it not only the idea that a woman's clothing should properly conceal her body, but also that it should be respectable, decent, well arranged. It should not damage her good reputation. Perhaps that's a good study for another time, but this might also tell us that there's a parallel here and a requirement for an elder to dress in a similar fashion. I found it very interesting that the Greek word that's used here by Paul to describe an elder's behavior is where we also get the word cosmos. You can kind of see that in that Greek spelling there. Cosmos referring to outer space. When we stare into the nighttime sky, or if we get a better look with a telescope, we see the beautiful, orderly nature of the universe and all of its different parts. And even though scientists of the world might tell us that this all happened by chance or just happened by chaos, we know that that's impossible. Such beautiful order requires planning and purpose. And in like manner, a person who is respectable does not become so just by accident. It takes work. It takes discipline. It takes purpose. Allow me to share some interesting thoughts by some commentators on this particular qualification of elders. In reference to the word respectable, Adam Clarke wrote, "A clownish, rude, or boorish man should never have the rule of the Church of God. The sour, the sullen, the boisterous should never be invested with a dignity which they would most infallibly disgrace." Albert Barnes said of the word that's translated as respectable, he said, "The most correct rendering, according to the modern use of language, would be that he should be a gentleman. He should not be slovenly in his appearance, or rough and boorish in his manners. And Matthew Henry notes that this qualification carries with it the idea of good behavior, composed and solid, not light or vain or frothy. Now that word caught my eye there. In fact, it kind of caught me off guard. What does it mean to be frothy? Well, you know what the froth on the top of a root beer or on the top of a cappuccino is like? It's light, it's airy. It's basically just a lot of air. It's a lot of bubbles, right? Well, similarly, a person who is frothy is light and entertaining, but of little substance. And I thought that was an interesting comparison there to the opposite of what an elder should be, the opposite of respectable. Now, some have also noted that the two preceding qualifications that Paul gave to Timothy for an elder, that he must be sober-minded and self-controlled, which Brother Daniel presented in our last study, those qualities mainly refer to the inward man. But this one, the next one, respectable, this refers more to the outward man. As Barnes noted, he must be a gentleman. He must mind his manners. Being respectable has a lot to do with a man's visible conduct, what others can see in him. Not so much his heart, although I believe his behavior and what they can see comes from his heart, certainly. But again, it has more to do with what people can perceive in the man, what people can see in him. And so we see then that a man who desires to be an elder must have qualities both inside and out that qualify him as a shepherd of God's people. Speaking of how others see him or perceive him, this quality of being respectable, of having good behavior, as other versions put it, I believe it's closely related to the next qualification that we want to consider. In 1 Timothy 3 and verse 7, Paul says that an elder must be well thought of by outsiders. Now, I think it's fair to say that the qualification of respectable in verse 2 certainly must include a man's reputation in the eyes of others, or how he's thought of. And again, well thought of, being respectable, those are very closely related. And so why did Paul seem to repeat himself here? Why did he come back and say the same thing a few verses later? Well, I think in verse 2, Paul had more in mind the fact that a man was respected or should be respected by members of the church. And certainly that must be important. If we're going to be led by a man, then we must respect him. But now in verse 7, Paul, it seems, felt it necessary to circle back, if you will, to come back to this point and make sure that the point was made, how important it is for an elder to have a good reputation, but this time specifically among those outside the church. The Greek word that Paul uses here is martyria, which according to Strong's carries the idea of a man's record, his report, his testimony, or his witness. Various versions translate the word as a good report, King James Version, a good testimony, New King James and American Standard, a good reputation, New American Standard and NIV, well thought of, the ESV and the New Revised Standard, and that people speak well of him is how the New Living Translation puts it. This Greek word is actually used many times, at least 32 by one count, throughout the Bible. It's used sometimes in a legal sense, as in a testimony before a judge. It's used in a historical sense. John, for example, who was an eyewitness to Jesus and to his life and his miracles, he confirms his testimony about Jesus and uses the same word here. And then here in 1 Timothy 3 and 7, it's used in an ethical sense. It's the testimony concerning a man's character. According to Thayer's Greek lexicon, the word is used in this sense. Again, it's used many times throughout the Bible, but it's used in this sense at least two more times. In 3 John, verse 12, in reference to Demetrius, John writes there, Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone, and from the truth itself we also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. And so a good reputation, again, we might say. It can also be used in a negative sense. It's used in that way in Titus 1, verse 13. Paul confirms there what's been said about the Cretans. Someone had said, in fact, a Cretan had said that they were liars and evil beasts and lazy gluttons. And Paul says, This testimony is true. In other words, he's confirming that the reputation that they have, a bad reputation, is in fact true. And so we see that the idea here is, again, a person's reputation. But it's a reputation that's based on facts. It's not just whether or not people like the man. And I found it interesting that this word martyria is closely related, as you can tell from the spelling, to the word martyr. A martyr is someone who gives their life because of, not just because of something they like, but because of what they believe to be true. And so again, this is based on facts and truths. It's obvious why a good reputation among members of the church would be required of a man. Again, if we're going to allow a man to shepherd over us, then we should respect his reputation. But as we said, Paul included this qualification for a more specific reason here. He says that an elder must be well thought of by outsiders. That is, by those outside the church, by those who are not even members of the church, not even Christians. And so why is that? What business is it of those who are not even members of the body of Christ, much less members of the local congregation who is choosing its leaders? What business is it of theirs to who the church is choosing, or what their opinion of a man is? Why should anyone outside the church have any bearing or any say in the matter? You've probably heard the popular phrase, "We're in the world, not of the world." I think there's songs that have used that wording, and it's based on several Bible passages. One is in 1 John 2. John urges us there, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world." And so you can see there the difference between us and the world. Also, on several occasions, Jesus said that neither he, nor his disciples, nor his kingdom were of this world. However, I'd like to point out something that perhaps this popular saying, "in the world, not of the world," maybe there's something that it's missing. In John the 17th chapter, Jesus is praying for his disciples. And he says there in verses 14 through 16, "I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world." And so far, the saying, "in the world, not of the world," that certainly seems to go along with Jesus' thoughts here, Jesus' prayer. But then notice what he says in verse 18. He says, "As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world." And so while it's true that we are not of the world, the Lord has sent us into the world. And he still wants us to shine as lights, according to his words in Matthew the 5th chapter. He still wants us to live peaceably with all men, so that we can have the greatest possible influence, according to Romans 12 and verse 18. Notice some other passages that support this truth. 1 Corinthians 10 and 13 says, "Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God." Those aren't people who are in, well, the last group there is those who are in the church, but Jews and Greeks we assume were those outside the church. Philippians 2 verse 15 says that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Colossians 4 and verse 5, "Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time." And 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 12, "So that you may walk properly before outsiders." And so we can see here that it is important for us to have a good reputation. It is important how outsiders view us and see us. And so in his instructions here to Timothy about what is required of an elder, Paul wants elders to be good citizens, good neighbors, good employees or good employers. He wants them to be men who will not attract outside criticism of the church. Commentator B.W. Johnson says of this verse that an elder must have an established character which speaks well for the church among the unconverted. He is an example for the church, if you will. Charles Erdman, another commentator, says an elder must not only be favorably known by his fellow Christians, but he must also have a good reputation in the community where the church is located. Otherwise, his ill repute may bring disgrace or attack upon the church. As you look back over the qualities and the qualifications that are mentioned both in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, think about how many of these can be seen and can be well thought of in a man's life, again, even by those outside the church. Think about how those in the community might say, he's a good husband, he's a good father, he's respectable, he's self-controlled, he's hospitable, he's not violent or quarrelsome or greedy or arrogant or a drunkard. Most, if not all these qualities, can and should be seen not only by members of the church, but by people that the man might come into contact with in his everyday life, in his town and in his community. And if we reverse any of these qualities, it's easy to see what a bad reputation or a bad testimony might look like. Brother Dale Wellman, in an article in the Christian Expositor's Journal, he made the following observation about this qualification. I thought this kind of hit the nail on the head. He said, if the local congregation were to ordain a man that the community, his workplace, or even his extended non-Christian family considers to be unfit and a poor example of Christianity, how will that possibly help the church in its outreach in that community? It will certainly not help, but will only drive people away. He said, I'm sure we've all heard stories of folks who said something like, well, if so-and-so goes to that church, I'm not interested in anything they have to say. But how much more so if that so-and-so is chosen to be a leader of that church? As I said, I think he pretty much hit the nail on the head there, and we can see why Paul thought it was so important for an elder to have a good reputation, to be well thought of by those on the outside. By the way, I highly recommend Brother Dale Wellman's article on this topic, as well as Brother Glenn Osborne's article on the next qualification that we want to notice, that being hospitable. Notice that and this is not that it makes it any more important than the others, but remember that this quality is actually specified by Paul in both his instructions to Timothy and to Titus. In fact, the idea of hospitality being expected among God's people is found throughout both the Old and the New Testaments, and we'll notice some of those verses just a little bit. But first of all, let's look at the meaning or the Greek original here. The Greek word that's translated as hospitable in our text is philoxenos, if I'm saying that correct. It comes from two Greek words, which at least one of these we may be very familiar with. Philos, or philo, that is can be translated as friend. It could also be translated as love. In fact, when we hear about the different types of love, agape, philo is one of those. It's a friendship type of love. And then xenos is the second word that's made up of here, which means stranger. And so the word hospitable, when you put those two pieces together, it quite literally means a friend of strangers. There's not a lot of variation among different translations or versions. Several versions use the word hospitable. The King James and the American Standard switch it to given to hospitality, which is obviously the same thing. The New Living Translation changes it up a little bit. It says, enjoy having guests in his home. And I think that last translation there is probably how we most often think of the word hospitable. When you hear that someone is hospitable, you think, oh, that means they invite people over to their house for dinner. And that's part of it. But when Paul wrote these words, and perhaps even more so when hospitality is spoken of in the Old Testament, it was more than just an occasional dinner invitation. And more importantly, it was extended to more than just friends and family. We go all the way back to Genesis, the 18th chapter. We see Abraham practicing hospitality. He invited the three strangers into his home, you may remember, and he was blessed for his kindness. Job said, the sojourner has not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the traveler. Job 31 and verse 32. In Leviticus, the 19th chapter, when God is giving his laws for His people, for the children of Israel, giving those laws to Moses, we find in verses 33 and 34, "And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, as family, and you shall love him as yourself." Again, that's what hospitality, at least in the Old Testament, was all about. Notice again the root meaning of the word hospitable, friend of strangers. What does it mean to be someone's friend? Well, I think Jesus gave us a perfect answer to that question in His parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke the 10th chapter. You remember that in reference to the command to love your neighbor as yourself, there was a lawyer who asked Jesus, "Well, who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answered by telling this story of a man who fell among thieves, who stripped him and beat him and left him for dead. And a priest and then a Levite came along and just passed by on the other side to avoid him. But then a Samaritan, who was the least likely of the three, you would think, but he saw him and he had compassion on him. And he treated his wounds and he brought him to an inn and he took care of him and he paid the innkeeper to continue caring for him even after he traveled on. And I can't think of a better example of what it means to be a friend of strangers than Jesus' example or His story right here. The word hospitable or hospitality can be found several times in the New Testament. In Romans, the 12th chapter and verse 13, Paul lists among the marks of a true Christian to contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Peter urges Christians to show hospitality to one another without grumbling. 1 Peter 4 verse 9. Among the requirements for a widow, in order for her to be supported by the church, it says that she must have shown hospitality, 1 Timothy 5:10. And the writer of Hebrews makes a very compelling plea. He says in Hebrews 13 verses 1 and 2, "Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." I have to admit, I cannot explain that last part about entertaining angels. But if nothing else, this stresses the importance of showing hospitality. Hospitality is a visible sign. It's something that we can measure, if you will, of someone's attitudes of love and selflessness and humility. And certainly those are characteristics that any leader should exemplify. Philippians 2 verses 3 and 4 says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." And I think we can see how humility fits in those descriptions. When Jesus described the day of judgment, you remember He was separating those on the left and those on the right. To those on the right, who He said, "Inherit the kingdom of my Father," one of the reasons that He gave for them being judged worthy of that kingdom was, "I was a stranger and you took me in," Matthew 25 and 35. Again, as I said, I recommend Brother Glenn Osborne's article on hospitality, but he had an interesting observation that I think further shows us the importance of hospitality. He says, and he's speaking of the early church here, he says, "Evangelism often emanated from the home." That is, spreading the gospel often started from the home. Some Christians historically practiced hospitality to strangers by going to the village well or water source and inviting travelers who were there looking for lodging, inviting them home with them. And this ultimately led to Christians being able to share the gospel with those who would accept the invitation to their home. Hospitality contributed to the spreading of the gospel worldwide. And so I think it's very clear that this quality of hospitality cannot be overemphasized. Well, in closing this morning, let me stress again that the qualities that we've noticed in our study today are ones that are expected of all Christians, not just elders. We all have the responsibility to live good, orderly, respectable lives, to behave ourselves, if you will, to be gentlemen or ladies for those women. We all have a circle of influence. We all have friends and co-workers and acquaintances. And as we've often said, sometimes you or I might be the only chance or the best chance that someone will ever have to learn the truth of the gospel. And so we have an opportunity and we have a responsibility to be well thought of, to have a good reputation of them. We need to guard our reputation so that we can hopefully lead them to Christ. And then, of course, as we've seen, we all have the responsibility to help those who are in need and to show hospitality not only to outsiders, but certainly to our brothers and sisters as well. But, as we've already stated, elders are certainly to be a model of what's expected of all Christians. They are to live an exemplary life that illustrates the mature and full-grown character of Christ. And that doesn't mean they're perfect. They may naturally be stronger in some of these qualities than in others. Remember, even the Apostle Paul admitted that he was still growing. He was still improving. But I hope that we can see and we can agree that the characteristics that we've studied today are crucial to being the kind of leader that the Lord's church needs and that it certainly deserves. I hope that you've gained something from the study this morning. We never end the service without offering the gospel invitation. If there is one here this morning who's never taken the steps of hearing the truth taught, believing it, showing your belief through obedience to it by repenting of your past sins, confessing your faith in Christ as the Son of God, and being baptized for the remission or forgiveness of your sins. If you've never taken those steps and been being added to the church, then we encourage you. There's no better time than today. Or if you've once taken those steps but you have not remained faithful and you would like the prayers of the church, or if you need the prayers of the church for any reason, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.